Thanks for joining us for the interview portion of the Data Speaks competition created in partnership with RFG 2018 and Sequent. I'm Nicole Doucette, a science communications specialist from Sequent, and I'm joined today by Alexandra from the University of British Columbia.
Hello.
Hello, welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, Alexandra, your original abstract title was Structural Mapping Through the Atacama Gravels Using Geomorphology, Implications for Exploration Undercover. So what is your revised non-specialist abstract title?
My title is Developing Tools for Finding Buried Mineral Deposits in the Atacama Desert Using Geochemistry and Geomorphology.
Great. And so what question are you trying to answer?
So essentially, one of the really big problems that we have in the mineral exploration industry, which is the industry that finds the new metal deposits, is that we are spending more and more money trying to find deposits, and we're not finding them as easily as we used to. And that's in part because a lot of the deposits that are left to find are actually buried under thick sequences of material that's been transported from elsewhere. And so we call these deposits blind because they don't have any surface expression, so they're extra hard to find. And more specifically, the problem is when we're trying to find these deposits using geochemistry, i.e. taking samples on the ground and looking at their metal concentrations and trying to follow the metal concentrations to the source. We're having a hard time because this transported cover that is burying these deposits has its own chemical signature, and so it can carry metals from afar. So when we're looking at using those metal concentrations, it makes it complicated that we're not sure if the metal is coming from the deposit below or if it's being transported from afar.
Right.
So the ultimate question is, can we develop more effective methods to try to see through that cover to the buried mineralization, which will hopefully help us find those deposits more effectively.
Great.
Yeah.
And so what concept does someone need to know to understand your research?
Probably the most important concept is the one that metals from a buried mineral deposit can migrate to the surface, and we depend on that process to sample those metals on the surface, and that's what we use to then vector back towards it. And in the Atacama Desert, the way that it works is actually super cool. So the groundwater interacts with the metals underground, and that releases metals into the groundwater. And during earthquakes, the structures in the grounds, the faults, compact and dilate and actually can pump the groundwater to the surface.
Wow.
Yeah, basically the groundwater is shot to the surface and creates puddles. And so that's our mechanism for getting those metals to the surface. And so we know that that's associated with structures specifically. So when we're designing these new methods to look for those metals that we know are coming from depth, we are using tools to identify what those ancient puddles may look like on the surface and trying to trace the faults on the surface that we know that groundwater is using to get those metals there.
Okay, and what role does data play in your research?
I use several types of data to try to get the whole story of what's happening in an area. So the first thing is I go into an area and map it. So there's a lot of mapping data involved with what types of gravels we're looking at. And in that, we use, in my project specifically, we use drone imagery. So that's a lot of data processing as well as elevation data processing. And so we use that to map the structures on the surface. And then the other huge part that's a lot of data is when we actually take the gravel samples and we send those to labs and it comes back with chemical data that's telling us the metal concentrations that are in those samples. And so we use all those different types of data to help us understand the full story of how those metals are getting to the surface.
Great.
Yeah.
And so why is it important for you to share your data and your research?
It's important because when we're trying to solve a problem as big as this one and trying to develop methods that industry can use. It's not just my research that's going to do it alone. The research that I'm doing builds on a lot of other research that's been previously done. And so in that sense, it's dependent on other people as well sharing their data. And so it's important as a community to try to solve problems together like that. As well, the data needs to be shared with the industry so that we can do exploration more effectively as an industry, so we can start to find these deposits faster, using less money, so we can provide metals for society.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us today, Alexandra.
Thank you.
Of course. Once again, this is the Data Speaks competition at RFG 2018, created in partnership with Sequent. You can watch the videos on YouTube or Twitter, #CDataSpeak.